So, in a recent paper published in 2017 on imaginary itineraries in the beyond, Robert Fowler wonders exactly when, during the 9-day storm from Cape Malea, Odysseus leaves this world and enters the beyond. This is the moment when Odysseus is buffeted by destructive winds for 9 days, according to the Odyssey, Book 9, and blown off course at a well-known point on the Mediterranean map, Cape Malea in the southeast Peloponnese. Of similar tone is Statius' description in his work Thebais, from where the first part of my talk's title comes from, of the promontory of Malea, standing aloof and looking down at nature's turmoil with serene detachment, inspiring awe. And I have the passage. There is a place where the dread promontory of foamy Malea rises into the air, its peak admits no gaze. Lofty stands the summit, and serene, looking down on winds and rain. Only the weary stars make it their seat. And in other passages of the Thebaid, the Latin poet refers to the foaming Malea's dreaded headland, which rises into the air, Malea shunned by doubting keels, the thunderous wrath of echoing Malea, and at times when tempests sit motionless in the clouds over the cape. And if you haven't visited the area, you may think that this is an exaggeration, but the locals and those who have visited it or worked in the area know that this is like a reality. So the inspiration of my talk stems from 3 of my recent and ongoing research projects: the study and publication of the Mycenaean tombs and the material culture from Epidavros Limira, which is now completed and has been published, the ongoing collaborative Pavlo Petri underwater archaeology project, and the new archaeology and history of the Malea Peninsula project from prehistory to nowadays, in collaboration with Dr. Eleni Kolaiti, Dr. Nikos Mourdzas, and Mr. Sarantos Minopetros. The talk will focus on the coastal exploitation of the Malea Peninsula in Mycenaean times, with emphasis on the port towns at Epidavros Limira and Pavlo Petri, and will seek to explore how principal environmental, geoarchaeological, and cultural factors might have determined the establishment, role, and function of harbors and anchorages in the southwestern Peloponnese at that time. The Malea Peninsula lies at the southwestern point of the Peloponnese and due north of Kythera. It is dominated by the mountain range of Parnon, so it's also known as the Parnon Peninsula, which constitutes the continuation of the easterly range of the Arcadian Mountains and runs southwest, terminating in its cape, the southeasternmost cape in continental Europe. The cape is steep, with cliffs of 600 meters high. Parnon divides the peninsula into 2 distinct territories between the Aegean Sea and the Laconian Gulf, and stretching down to the cape. The geomorphology of the peninsula is dominated by Triassic dolomites and phyllites, and is largely occupied by peaks of rather low altitude, with the highest being Chrysanthi at 772 meters that terminates at the cape. The western Maleatic coast largely intends by sedimentary gulfs that were occupied throughout or in intervals in prehistoric times, whereas the eastern slope falls abruptly into the sea, with shelter provided only by few natural harbors and anchorages. On the western coast, Elaphonisos, on Gnathos in antiquity, which translates into donkey's jawbone, was attached to the adjacent mainland, the modern Viglafia coast, in antiquity. The Malea Peninsula was largely isolated from the north by difficult country, and journeys along the coast were usually easier by sea until very recently. In a sense, the peninsula seems to have operated more like an island for millennia. This complex geomorphological formation of the Parnon Range causes the extremely violent encounter of winds, especially those blowing from north to northwest across the Aegean Sea, known as the Etesian winds, or locally as Meltemia, and also severe currents of Cape Malea. At this point, I should stress how valuable Dr. David Conlin's PhD thesis at Brown University, it was submitted in 1999, is, still for our understanding of seafaring conditions in Mycenaean Peloponnese. And this thesis is yet one of those gems that have not been published yet. The rounding of a headland is one of the most difficult nautical problems which a sailboat may face. In order to round a headland like Cape Malea, and you can see how it looks like from the sea, the most favorable winds for a hypothetical Bronze Age ship come from astern or just off the stern. Coming to the tip of the cape, however, the most favorable winds must come from the exact opposite direction as those which have been favorable previously. Compromise wind directions occur at right angles to the path of travel and provide acceptable, although not optimal, sailing winds for moving around the cape. The cruel geometry, of windward sailing makes it difficult to move contrary to the wind. And in areas such as those that surround not just Laconia, Cape Malea and Cape Tenaron, but also Messina, typically have currents landing up on top of the winds. So this makes traveling impossible. Meteorological data for Laconia show that in the seas around the Cape, winds the northern quarter, that is northeast, north and northwest, predominate in every month, and aggregated annually account for approximately 175 days per year. In contrast, winds from the southern quarter, these are southeast, south, and southwest, occur only 79 days annually. The point that David Conlin makes in his thesis is that the northern winds provide the most favorable run northwards to the tip, northwards to the tip, but are exactly the wrong ones for the run northwards up the other side. So if you are traveling around Maleas, the problem is that the winds that are the most favorable to a ship moving to the tip of the Cape become the least favorable once the ship has rounded it. What was once a good-looking breeze has become an unfavorable headwind, which makes progress back up the other side of the Cape difficult or impossible. The rapid change of winds and currents render the supernavigation of the Cape an extremely treacherous enterprise even today. As I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, in Book 9 of the Odyssey, we hear of the grave problems that Odysseus encountered while attempting to round the Cape westwards on his way to Ithaca. And we read in that passage, and now all unscathed would I have reached my native land, but the waves and the current and the north wind, this is a combination that's not good, beat me back as I was riding Malea and drove me off course past Kythera. Northerly winds draw ships out of their anchorages and make the trip southwards to the tip a relatively easy voyage, but make both the return trip to the other side and turning back to where the trip started impossible. In contrast, southerly winds are not favorable for a trip in a southerly direction and have the net effect of keeping ships in their anchorages or simply pushing them back to the harbors from where they originally sailed to try another day or even weeks later. Sometimes it could be up to 3 weeks, thus causing delays and disruption. Eastern anchorages, some of them are Kiparisi, Zarax, and Phalangidia, and the port of Epidaphros Limira are the safest ones, whereas the western side, the western coast, is not as safe. But I will get back to that in a minute. This observation is confirmed by David Conlin and Eleni Kolaitis' research, and also by the ongoing work by Sarantos Minopetros, a merchant marine engineer from Agios Nikolaos Vion, an honorary researcher at the University of Nottingham, who is currently researching the medieval to pre-modern nautical history of the Cape. Another problem that Mycenaean mariners would have encountered while attempting to safely round Cape Malea are the distances between its tip and safe havens for beaching ships on the occasion of unfavorable sailing conditions. According to Conlin's and Minopetros' estimates, moving from east to west, one must sail 37 kilometers of relative unsheltered steep coastline from Epidaurus Limira, showing it here, to the tip of the Cape. Sailing this distance could take between 5.6 to 8.2 hours, depending on time of year. Moving in the opposite direction, from west to east, the closest port at Pavlopetri sits 22.2 kilometers from the southernmost extent of the peninsula, and this distance could take between 4.3 and 6.3 hours to sail in aggregate. Of course, smaller protected bays, as we can see, and anchorages might have served as emergency harboring havens should the force of winds, currents, and waves allow access. The Homeric description mentions that waves and the current combined with the strong and favorable north winds caused Odysseus misfortune, and it has caused a lot of misfortunes also much later. According to Nicholas Fleming, a very valuable member of the Pavlopetri Underwater Archaeology Project, the waves refracted around Cape Malea have the greatest effect from storms in the Aegean, with the island of Kythera providing only partial shelter from the west and southwest. Quite often, winds and currents are moving in different and sometimes the exact opposite directions in the Cape, with wave faces becoming dangerously steep and sea conditions extremely dangerous to small sea crafts like the Mycenaean ones. The high steep promontory of the Cape and the land that surrounds it makes it ideal breeding ground for the dangerous falling winds that arise out of nowhere, causing chaos. Illustrative of the danger of rounding the Cape is Strabo's famous account of the nautical adage, when you double Malea, forget your home. Local mariners attach the toponym the Mavri Kardia to Malea, the Black Heart of Malea, to the prominent arc of darkened limestone at its tip, and believe that it would have been in fact here where Odysseus might have encountered the sea monsters Scylla and Charybdis, paralleling the sea monsters with the clashing winds and currents. It might have been an occasion such as this that King Menelaus encountered as he reached Cape Malea. Terrible storms wreaked havoc on his fleet, and he was whirled to the southwestern Mediterranean as far as Egypt. 8 more years passed until he managed to return to his palace in Sparta, and that's in Book 3 of the Odyssey. Tectonics, eustatic sea level changes, erosion, and extreme events, including tsunamis, have resulted in the alteration of the peninsula's coastline since prehistory. Geodynamic processes in the area are related to the active subduction of the African lithosphere beneath the Eurasian plate. The region displays long-term uplift as postulated by the uplifted late Quaternary marine terraces and a short-term historic subsidence along the coastline, as has been shown by Efthymios Karimbalis and colleagues, by the Hellenic Center for Marine Research, and by Drs. Eleni Kolaiti and Nikos Mourtsas of ACTES and the University of Nottingham. The Eastern Peloponnesian coastline is rich in geomorphological and archaeological sea level indicators and instrumental for the development of this field for the region. Among others are the early studies of the oceanographer Dr. Nicholas Fleming, and more recently, Dr. Eleni Kolaiti's PhD pioneering thesis at the University of Peloponnese, which has undertaken the systematic geoarchaeological research along the entirety of the eastern coast of the Peloponnese, stretching for 785 kilometers, starting from the Saronic Gulf on the north, all around the Argolis Peninsula, the Myrtone Sea, and ending in the West Laconic Gulf, including 74 locations. And here is a map that shows coastal archaeological sites with clear evidence for relative sea level change that Eleni has produced. From the systematic analysis and synthesis of the Peloponnesian sites, the curve of the mean relative sea level change during the late Holocene was deduced for the area under study. So Eleni has identified 8 former sea level stands from minus 8.8 meters, dated back to the 7.2 millennia BP, to minus 0.35 in the meters in the early 20th century, as well as 6 intermediate stands corresponding to different historical periods between them. The curve indicates the inferred periods of the relative sea level stability by horizontal lines and change by ascending lines, which reflect the different rates of sea level rise between chronological ranges. We shall now move on to explore how these environmental and geomorphological factors might have affected the formation and development of local communities and important harbour towns on the peninsula, with a focus on Epidavros Limira and Pavlopetri during the Late Bronze Age and their interaction also with other Aegean communities. My talk will not discuss the importance of land routes and their contribution in intersite connections and interactions on and beyond the peninsula and their combination with the sea routes. This information is included in our upcoming publication of the Pavlopetri Underwater Archaeology Project. The Malea Peninsula was densely occupied throughout the Mycenaean period, as indicated by the numerous Mycenaean tombs that are shown on the map to the left, and also habitation sites, mainly during fieldworks and occasionally through archaeological excavation. Many more excavations are actually required. But now let's look briefly into our case studies. So Epidavros Limira, also known as Palea or Old Monemvasia, lies on the eastern coast of the peninsula on the Paleocastro Hill, a limestone outcrop, just 5 kilometers north of a small coastal plain and just few meters ashore on the eastern side of the Palea Monemvasia Bay and around 5 kilometers north of the medieval castle town of Monemvasia. The bay is located within the zone of contact between Cape Malea and the limestone range of Parnon. It is bordered by Cape Kremidi on the north and Cape Camili to the south, creating a well-protected harbour site with clear views towards the Cycladic Islands and towards a major section of the Myrton Sea coastline. Pausanias admired the site's coast, mentioning that the beach here contains pebbles of prettier form and all colors. Among 3 kilometers to the west of the Paleocastro Hill, the small, steep, and much eroded hill of Flomos, near the modern village of Agios Ioannis, possesses a strategic position overseeing the ancient land route network from central Laconia to Epidavros Limira, and this is the only good route from central Laconia to our coastal side. It also oversees the adjacent fertile valley, the rich watercourses of Agia Triada, also known as Tassou or Stassou, and Vamvakia, also known as Potamia, and a natural spring to the west. Neolithic and Bronze Age sherds, including Mycenaean and Obsidian, have been uncovered on the Flomos Hill, which would have functioned as a satellite settlement to the much more important one on the Paleocastro Hill. Surface exploration in 1957 by the British archaeologists Helen Waterhouse and Richard Holmes Simpson on the Paleocastro Hill, where the remains of the classical Acropolis stand today, brought to light a number of late Helladic 3A and B sherds. The pre-Mycenaean occupation of the Acropolis is confirmed by the presence of Neolithic and early and Middle Bronze Age pottery sherds and obsidian. Although no prehistoric domestic architectural remains have been identified to date on the Acropolis Hill or its environs, it is generally assumed that the Mycenaean center was probably situated on the summit. Mycenaean chamber tombs have been explored to the south and southwest of the hill, at Sternes, near the modern village of Agios Ioannis that I mentioned earlier, and at the steep sides of the nearby Kranapa ravine. There are more than 100 tombs, but only few of them were excavated by Karahalios in the 1930s and by Drandakis and Christou in the 1950s. The chamber tombs produced a major corpus of fine and coarse Mycenaean pottery, ranging from the end of the Middle Helladic and the transition to the Late Helladic one to the sub-Mycenaean period. They also produced bronze weapons, beads, and various materials, loom weights, and buttons of terracotta and steatite. There is also strong evidence to suggest that the Mycenaean chamber tomb type was introduced for the first time in this area. The evidence is published in my monograph on the burial tradition in Mycenaean Laconia, and I would be very happy to discuss this further during the Q&A. There are also submerged architectural remains in the bay. However, these seem to be of later date, not prehistoric, most probably dating from the Archaic to Roman times, and snorkeling at the site did not produce any indications of prehistoric remains underwater. There is no evidence for Bronze Age harbor installations, and the shallow draft Mycenaean vessels would have been either dragged up onto the beach or anchored into the settled bay. I shall now move onto the western coast of the peninsula, just off the Punda shore, near the modern village of Tiglaphia, opposite the island of Elafonisos in the Vatica Bay, where the now submerged port town at Pavlopetri is located. The prehistoric settlement was positioned in a small basin-like depression, protected from the sea by a low ridge of rock to the south and southeast, and facing a sandy bay to the south and southwest that provided a natural haven for seafaring. The island of Elafonisos was connected to the mainland by an isthmus that protected Pavlopetri from west winds. The underwater architectural remains were first reported by Phokionas Negris and were once more brought to public attention in 1967 by Nicholas Fleming. Subsequently, an archaeological team from the University of Cambridge surveyed the site, and since 2009, the site has been surveyed and studied by the Pavlopetri Underwater Archaeology Project, a joint collaboration between the effort of Underwater Antiquities of the Hellenic Ministry of Culture, the University of Nottingham, and the Hellenic Centre for Marine Research under the auspices of the British School at Athens. The site has produced evidence for three chamber tombs of Mycenaean date, an extensive cemetery of schist graves that have been recorded underwater, while a large necropolis of early Helladic and late Helladic rock tombs lies on the Punda shore. The survey of Pavlopetri has revealed an underwater town extending over an area of at least 8 hectares, and further remains of buildings are covered by sandbanks, so this is a minimum estimate of the town's extent. We cannot as yet clarify to which periods the house remains recorded in the survey belong, but judging from the diagnostic pottery recovered from the site, it seems to have reached the climax in the late Middle Helladic, early Mycenaean period, and we would suggest, subject to ongoing research, that the elaborate pattern of houses fronting on streets was established by this time. Contemporary settlements in the vicinity seem to vary in extent. The precise figure for Castrion Kythera is not certain, but it appears to have covered up to 11 hectares, and at Agios Stephanos it has been estimated at 2.7 hectares. At Methoni in Messenia, the settlement is estimated up to 12 hectares. For comparison, Anno Eglianos is thought to have covered about 5.5 hectares in Middle Helladic and 7 hectares by Late Helladic 1-2. These data are not at all robust, but do suggest that maritime towns could be quite large, with populations of many hundreds, perhaps even thousands, that they were relatively stable, persisting over many centuries, and evidently secure in the sense that we have no evidence for defenses beyond their natural sitting. I should mention that the earliest evidence for occupation at Pavlopetri comes from the late and final Neolithic. And this is evidence that has come through the most latest survey. Overall, some 2,000 artifacts were recovered over the 3 field seasons of the Pavlopetri Underwater Archaeology Project in 2009-2011, half from pickup survey over the whole site and half from the 2 small trials open to investigate the stratigraphy of the site. There were very peculiar protocols on how many sherds we could pick up every day. It needs to be stressed that most of the finds have suffered from the action of sand, marine flora and fauna, and seawater for 3,000 to 4,000 years. Very often the original surface of a vase has not survived. The poor state of the pottery plainly makes typological identification that much more difficult. All the same, we have been able to make some progress. It must also be stressed that care needs to be taken in making comparisons between the sample from Pavlopetri and that from other contemporary sites for a number of reasons. First, because the pottery shells that we have are unstratified finds that cannot be dated by context. Secondly, because the circumstances of collection underwater rather than from land probably affect the relative visibility of different types of pottery. And thirdly, the extreme surface abrasion seriously affects comparative analysis. The site was first, as I said, occupied in the late and final Neolithic period and continued to be used without interruption until around 1900 BC. Survey also brought to light evidence for activity at the site in the Archaic, Classical, Hellenistic, Roman, and Late Antique periods. Like at Epidavros Limira and other Maleatic coastal towns, the survey has not produced any evidence for permanent Bronze Age harbor installations, and vessels would have been dragged east and west of the settlement onto the sandy beach of Vatica Bay or of the Elaphonissos Isthmus. According to Eleni Kolaitis' analysis, on the basis of the geomorphological indicators of the relative sea level change and their correlation, 5 distinct sea levels can be determined for Vatica Bay, which, based on the identified archaeological sea level indicators, can be dated to respective periods, starting from the deepest stand at 5 meters, dating back to the early Helladic period, and the next sea level at 4.5 meters to the late Helladic period. Until the late 12th century BC, the sea level was at least 3 meters lower than at present. We should also address the question of whether Pavlo Petri was protected from waves or not, and this is very important information for seafaring. This type of analysis is not currently available for Epidavros Limira. Statistical analysis of raw wind data by Nick Fleming have shown that the dominant local wind is from the north, so it is on a lee shore. Kolaitis' analysis of raw wind data, the wind rose diagram of average daily wind speed and direction frequencies, pointed to the northwest and north winds being more frequent and stronger than the west, east, and south winds. The prehistoric town was protected to the north, northeast, and northwest by the mainland, as is the case today, but it was also protected to the west through its occupation later during the period when the Elaphonissos Strait was still land. The only direction in which there is a significant fetch up to 150 kilometers is southeast, towards the northwest coast of Crete, while in the southerly direction there is a significantly shorter fetch of 30 kilometers toward the northeast coast of Kythera, and an even shorter fetch in an easterly direction, not exceeding 10 kilometers towards the west coast of the Malea Peninsula. The location and orientation of the coast of the prehistoric settlement indicate that the waves were generated by south and southeast winds, which create the longest fetch. The wind wave analysis for the study period observed a wave height of 4.2 meters produced by southeast winds. Therefore, if the ridge that bounds the prehistoric town on the east side had a minimum equivalent elevation, then the town would have been fully protected from the waves. Given that the ridge is now at maximum not 8 meters below sea level, below mean sea level, with the exception of Pavlo Petri Island and the Hamokelo islet of the site, now projecting from the sea, it follows that with a minimum sea level 5 meters lower than the present, the town or even its remains would not have been affected by waves, even extreme storm waves, whatever the weather conditions. Kolaitis' conclusion differs from Fleming's suggestion that the lower level structures at Bronze Age Pavlo Petri could have been floated quite seriously once every 100 years, even at the time of foundation of buildings. Let's move on, and due to its strategic location at the crossroads of a very busy sea route network within the Aegean, the Malea Peninsula would have been significant in the context of late Bronze Age sailing, in particular the route from Crete via Kythera towards the mainland and beyond. Our 2 case studies lie on important routes of communication by sea and offer shelter, as we've seen, 100% of the time in all conditions. The distance from Onugnathos to Cape Platanistus in the northern tip of Kythera is around 7.4 kilometers, so only 40 states according to Roman writers, and from there 118 kilometers to the Minoan town of Kydonia in West Crete. On clear weather, one can clearly see the Lefka Ori from our region. The first route that Janko has proposed from Crete via Kythera towards the mainland and beyond was the northwest via Cape Malea and Pavlopetri, and then either due west towards Cape Tenaron and the Mani Peninsula, or along the coast via the important site of Agios Stephanos, a lengthier but safe voyage, according to Richard. The anchorages at Panagia on Elafonisos, so along the western coast, the Monia Castelli, Elea, and Acrie, and the harbour of Asopos would have formed a nexus of safe anchorages for the circulation of merchandise from the western Maleatic coast via Pavlopetri towards the western Peloponnese and northwards to Agios Stephanos and inland Laconian sites. Of particular note is the now badly eroded coastal site of Asopos Bozas on the Xyli promontory to the north of Pavlopetri, which must have been a site of economic, commercial, and administrative significance since the 3rd millennium BC, as suggested by the discovery of an impressed clay ceiling from within an early Helladic building with storage rooms and also a group of 11 early Mycenaean vases, late Helladic 1 and late Helladic 2a, products of looting that most probably originate from at least 2 or perhaps more graves at the site. The late Helladic 1 pottery shows distinct similarities with pottery from Tiryns. The material has been published by Kate Dimakopoulou, whereas the 4 late Helladic 2a pots included this scuttle of red micaceous ware that bears some resemblance to contemporary vessels of same style or fabric from Castri on Kythera and from Aierini on Kea. Katie Dimakopoulou argued that it may not be impossible that this Asopos scuttle may be a Kytheran import. Locally produced red micaceous ware is present at other nearby coastal sites, however, most probably at Agios Stephanos, Pavlopetri, and Epidavros Limira. The second route from Crete via Kythera towards the mainland and beyond was to the northeast, past Cape Maleas and Epidavros Limira, and then either east to Milos or north up to the coast towards the Argolid, Corinthia, and Attica and beyond. Janko has argued, and I quote, that on the western trade route, the Cretan zone of control crossed Cape Malea in the sense that they used a pair of heavily Minoanized ports on either side of it to facilitate its passage. End of quotation. And he means Pavlopetri and Epidavros Limira, especially since each site was once protected by a narrow isthmus with beaches on both sides, which could serve as safe harbors. But where in fact are 2 sites that heavily Minoanized or even under the control of the Minoans? Due to the constraints of time, I will have to restrict the discussion to only very few selected examples from a much larger ceramic corpus to address the equation Epidavros Limira is Minoa of Laconia and put it to the test, while also looking a bit closer into material culture from the sites under discussion. In their descriptions of Laconia, Strabo and Pausanias mention an ancient site, Minoa, in association with Epidavros Limira. And the passages are, and also Minoa, a stronghold which has the same name as the place in Megaris, and Epidavros Limira, as Artemodorus says. And then the other passage is, and by the town, meaning Epidavros Limira, there is a cape projecting out to sea opposite the city called Minoa. The ancient toponym of Minoa has been generally attributed, upon the influence of the ancient periegetic and geography sources, to at least 8 coastal or island sites in the Aegean and the Mediterranean. In 1932, Faust proposed that Minoae were probably towns of later date founded on either old Cretan settlements, possibly during the Bronze Age, therefore echoing the Minoan tradition. The location of Minoa on the Malea Peninsula is yet to be identified, if it ever existed. Corres mentions 2 Minoas in Laconia, a rocky islet off the coast of Laconia, and one near Epidavros Limira. Hood and Janko have been inclined to equate Minoa with the rocky medieval settlement at Monemvasia that you see here. They incorrectly, however, associated the old village of Epidavros Limira with the medieval town of Monemvasia. These are the 2 different sites. And they had they had they sorry they were this was partly a misunderstanding because this is due to Hobsonson and Waterhouse, who reported that Carl Blegen had found Mycenaean swords and a stone tool at the village of Malea, Monemvasia. They incorrectly, however, associated the old village of Epidavros Limira with the medieval town of Monemvasia, because these are two different sites. It's almost certain that the Mycenaean swords reported by Hobsonson and Waterhouse as coming from Monemvasia are in fact the 12 swords that Blegen inventoried as coming from the Mycenaean chamber tombs at Epidavros Limira, which are now in the collection of the American School of Classical Studies at Athens. Such a confusion of place names should also explain Waterhouse and Hobsonson's note in their publication that, and I quote, when questioned, he, Blegen, did not recall having found Mycenaean pottery at Monemvasia. End of quotation. Despite its position at the crossroads of the busy sea and land route network of southeast Laconia, the stronger Minoanizing trends noticed on the material culture from Agios Stephanos and of Pavlo Petri are not paralleled in the archaeological corpus of Epidavros Limira. Of course, at Epidavros Limira, we are dealing only exclusively with tomb material and finer wares. However, the early Mycenaean and main palatial material culture from the chamber tombs, which comprise both vessels of fine and coarse ware, is clearly local in fabric and shapes with Cretan and Kythiran influences detected mostly on the decoration. There are very, very few actual imports. I'll bring you here some examples. A few examples of locally produced Southern Peloponnesian lustrous decorated red micaceous and mudstone and chert wares come from our side and also from Pavlo Petri and Agios Stephanos, but they coexist with examples of the local dark burnished ware. Conical cups, which are associated with the Minoan culture, do not appear at Epidavros Limira until late Helladic 2b, 3A1, although examples of the type and of earlier date have been found at Pavlo Petri, Agios Stephanos, and sites on Kythera. Minoan domestic shapes like braziers and lamps are totally absent, as in the case of Agios Stephanos and Pavlo Petri. In the late Helladic 1 to 2 repertory, for example, Minoan-inspired motifs are frequently employed for the decoration of vases whose shape, alabaster or squat jugs, point to pure development from the Middle Bronze Age on the mainland. The monochrome interior and the white slip of the majority of these vessels, on the other hand, could point to Minoan and Kythiran influences. The late Helladic 2A pottery from the site includes Dickinson's palatial class that imitates and adapts Minoan shapes, but with motifs of mainland inspiration, like examples that we have already been published. His domestic class that continues the late Helladic 1 repertoire of shapes, and Maujoy's pseudo-Minoan class, which features exact imitations of late Helladic 1B vases that were produced on the mainland. The late Helladic 3AB pottery styles at Epidavros Limira are consistent with those from the rest of Laconia and other contemporary sites on the mainland. Distinct decorative features, for example, the painting of a spiral with or without a central eye, instead of concentric circles on the basis of alabastra, point to a local Laconian tradition predating the evolution of similar patterns on the mainland. A revived Laconian interest in Minoan trades is attested in certain examples of late Helladic 3A2 pottery from the site, but at that time and throughout the main palatial period, it maintained strong connections with centers in mainland Laconia and other parts of the mainland and the rest of the Aegean. We have suggested in previous publications produced by myself and Professor Kavanagh that a Mycenaean ruler from central Laconia could have exercised control over southern Laconia, probably at Agios Stephanos. The site's decline in LH 3A2 might have been the result of interference in maritime affairs, possibly by the palace at Agios Vasilios. It is not certain whether palatial interest may have favored Epidavros Limira for a brief period, until the palace of Agios Vasilios, for example, was burned down in late Helladic 3B1, as one of the most important ports in the region during the period of decline of Agios Stephanos, but it may be tempting to put forward this hypothesis as food for thought for further research, since Epidavros limira easier access by land from central Laconia, as opposed to land access to western Maleatic ports and harbors like Pavlopetri, might have permitted merchant sailors to trade while avoiding the perilous route of Cape Malea. There are no Minoan imports at the site before late Helladic 3C. Epidavros limira was one of the few Laconian sites that survived and flourished after the collapse of the Mycenaean palatial administration and well into the sub-Mycenaean period, and its pottery could speak volumes for the port's active role within the Aegean exchange network during this turbulent period. Cretan, Cycladic, Dodecannesian, and mainland trades on its pottery suggest that the site acted as a crucible in which diverse traditions were integrated and adapted. And here I'm showing you a selection of post-palatial, late Helladic 3C, and sub-Mycenaean vases, either imported or inspired from Crete and elsewhere, that have been found in the tombs at Epidavros limira. So some of them, as I said, are Minoan inspired. Others are actual imports. And also, Penelope Mountjoy has convincingly argued that the workshop specializing in the production of pottery, namely stirrup jars and craters with octopus-style decoration, complemented with ray motifs, exports of which have been uncovered on Naxos, Palea, Epidavros, and Perati, was established at Epidavros limira during the late Helladic 3C period. According to Oliver Dickinson, in fact, to judge, I quote, from the number of likely Aegean imports, Epidavros limira might be thought the most significant site, and it may well have been from here that a deep bowl very close to one from Mycenae reached the Amycleon, and also a Minoan-looking stirrup jar reached Pelana. The available data do not support the equation Epidavros limira is Minoa, and I could not agree more, again, with Oliver Dickinson's statement. You will have understood by now, and the times that I've used him, like his research in my book, that he's one of my favorite Aegeanists. Quote, by colonization, garrisoning, or domination by Minoan ruling class, no, not here, and even more empathetically, not in the southern Peloponnese. To me, the memory of a busy and welcoming port, very close to the notorious Cape Malea, but also to the Minoan Emporium of Castria at Kythera, might have been preserved in the stories of individual communities throughout the centuries. Relevant to this may be Emily Vermeule's comment that about 24 hills overlooking island ports in the Aegean are named Minoa. At least 4 of them reflecting this phase of the Minoan thalassocracy, although some are named only in nostalgia later. Looking, however, towards Pavlopetri, the Minoanizing traits on the ceramic material and actual Cretan imports collected at the site are intriguing. In addition to examples of red micaceous, southern Peloponnesian lustrous decorated and mudstone and church wares mentioned above, and conical cups. You can see examples on the slide. Large pithoi vessels locally produced under Minoan or Kytheran influence, and actual Cretan imports have been identified. An example is Pithos A2 with a capacity of around 85 liters. It is elaborately decorated with a distinctive row of stamped spirals just below the neck and a band with impressed finger tipping just below the belly. The 5 handles would have made lading much easier. Not quite globular, the general form of the vase is similar to the globular pithoi in Kostis Christakis typology, but there are much closer parallels from Castrion Kythera. This type of vase may have been used for transport, as suggested by its smaller size and easier handling. There is no evidence for what it would have contained, but the distinctive stamp decoration could have signaled in any transaction what the contents were. It was made from a clay-fired reddish brown with a black ore with much quartz and other inclusions. The examples from Kythera were produced in a different fabric, whereas another pithos from our site was made in red micaceous ware. These various jars and pithoi, therefore, are seem to be of different sizes and evidently made with different technologies, but appear to be locally produced for trade. Another, and this is like a photo of that Pithos A2. Another Pithos A6, is an elaborately decorated one with elaborate decoration of applied cordons and overlapping discs. The vase is constructed of a hard orange clay with thick walls and was coated with slip. There were traces of burnish marks on the lower body. This large, heavy, and elaborate vessel is almost certainly of Minoan origin. Parallels can be quoted from Knossos, Tilissos, Zakros, and Malea. I'm showing you also this fragmentary spouted jar, which is similar to two examples from shaft grave Omicron in grave circle B at Mycenae, and to at least one example from a shipwreck of a middle Minoan 3, late Minoan 1 date, that was found at the area around Koulendi, few nautical miles north of Pavlopetri on the western Maleatic coast, and that was a discovery made in 2009. Pavlopetri's link with Kythera are also manifested in the bronze Minoan style figurine. This was recovered during the survey of the Cambridge team at Pavlopetri, with its right arm raised in worship. In its simple schematic style is reminiscent of a large number of similar ones from the big sanctuary at Agios Georgios στο Βουνό on nearby Kythera, which were being cast from ingots nearby, and also a Bronze Age figurine from the settlement at Triada on Rhodes. No doubt, the coastal communities on the Malea Peninsula lived with a long tradition of direct contact and constant interaction with Kythera and Crete throughout the late Bronze Age, and played a significant part in introducing those Minoan cultural influences which transformed the mainland at different stages. However, going back to the equation, is Epidavros Limira, or even southern Laconia, Minoa, our argument is that Minoanizing is not the same as Minoan. Having established the important contribution of the two Maleatic port sites in the context of Kytheran and Cretan trade and exchange interactions with the mainland, we shall now move on into other aspects of the economic and strategic value of our port sites in regulating and facilitating other types of interactions in this part of the late Bronze Age Aegean. I shall start with human resources. Considering the perils of rounding the Cape, the service of local mariners with advanced knowledge of tactical sailing would have been vital to traversing mariners, possibly in a similar way as the Suez Canal Authority pilots nowadays. Let's also not forget Pausanias' mention of a tomb of Kynados, one of Menelaus' pilots, which was located on the promontory of Onugnathos close to Pavlopetri. It's really interesting to make such a connection. Those local pilots would have been able to read the weather warnings, recognize the right environmental signs, and make vital decisions for safe sailing around the Cape, take the ship to safe havens at times of danger at sea, serve as shipping agents at the port, and assist sea merchants against raids and piracy. And very often we forget that the role of ports in the Bronze Age might have also be associated with these tasks. The importance of ports and harbors in the supply of, food, water, and mass and ores, among many other things, cannot be stressed enough. Medieval sources inform us of the wealth of our both sides in timber, with at least 5 forests recorded in the Vatica region. If you go nowadays, you won't find any of these forests. Timber was extremely important for ship construction, an important parameter in the rise of the Mycenaean naval power, and would have been valuable cargo exported from the Maleatic sites. Both our sites and others along the Maleatic Peninsula provided reliable sources of clear drinkable water through springs and perennial streams, and are located close to rich agricultural areas for the supply of ships with these valuable commodities. On the 1968 plant of the Pavlopetri Island, a well of unspecified date, but nevertheless a useful indication of the availability of water at the site is marked. Also, in order to exploit the rich farmland, rural communities, probably subordinate to the two port sites, were established inland during the main palatial period. Strong confirmation that these populations were engaged in strenuous physical labor comes from the cemetery population at Sikea, which is in close proximity to Epidavros Limira. Dr. Athanasia Papathanasiou has identified physical injuries that are indicative of increased physical activity, intense mobility, and strain. In addition to engaging to agricultural activities, the locals would have exploited the plentiful marine resources in the environments of both sides for trade and profit. In addition to being important both sides of fishery, Pavlopetri would also have been known for the mariculture of murex. The discovery of murex sea snails on the Pavlopetri island, the identification of a large underwater midden made up of murex cells offshore from the site, the close proximity to Kythera, known in antiquity as Porphyrusa, because of the beauty of the purple garments made there, according to Aristotle, may strongly suggest that the site was involved in the exploitation of the beds of murex sea snail in this part of the Laconian Gulf, the manufacture of the precious purple dye and of purple dyed textiles, and then their export. The suggestion of the presence of a thriving textile industry at the site is further supported by the presence of a very large number of clay loom weights, few collected during the surveys and many more strewn on the seabed of the sunken town. 11 large discoid loom weights with a single hole end of Minoan type, similar to those from Castrion Kythera, may have been used for weaving linen to make sails. We owe this suggestion to Sarantos Minopetros, and this brings to mind that Bronze Age ports must have had their ships chandlers to supply many of the goods which do not survive archaeologically, from food to ropes and houses, masts and oars. It is also worth mentioning that the evidence from Pavlopetri and my own research in the Vatica Bay shows that all three murex sea snail types, the Hexaplex trunculus, Bolinus brandaris, and Stramonita hemastoma, used for purple dye production in the past were and still are present in the Laconian Sea. The three different species would have been processed to achieve different hues of the purple. Later sources do mention that the coast of Laconia produced the best purple after Phoenicia itself. The smaller numbers of purple dyeing cells found at Aiostephanos and Kastri, despite the fact that both sites were active textile production centers in the second millennium BC, and that Kytheran women and their children are recorded as textile workers in the Linear tablets from Pylos, may suggest that these two sites were possibly centers for fabric dyeing and textile manufacture, but not necessarily sites for the production of the dye itself, thus is operating in a similar way to the dyeing workshop at Pefka on Crete. Pavlopetri may therefore have been the main production center and supplier of the precious dye in the region, while also producing expensive textiles, also probably for export. Finally, I would like to refer to the peninsula's metallic ores, which are second only to those of Lavrion in Attica and Sifnos and Kythnos in the Cyclades. The most prolific copper and lead ores on the peninsula are located near Sikea, Molai, and Apidia. The use of Laconian copper and lead ores during the Bronze Age has yet to be proven scientifically, but should not be excluded without evidence to the contrary. Despite the lack of compositional analysis, there are few but strong indications of the possible exploitation of these Laconian ores in prehistory, such as the presence of slags mixed with early Bronze II pottery and Milian obsidian at Cape Bournias, Agios Georgios, and Agios Fokas. Metalworking above hearths was taking place at Aiostephanos from the early Middle Helladic onwards. The apparent concentration of metalworking at Kastri on Kythera during the Bronze Age and the presence of early late Bronze Age copper ingot fragments in a small pit below a house floor may provide further proof of the importance attached by the Minoans to the Laconian metal resources at the earlier phase of the late Bronze Age. Copper ingots were imported to Kythera and would have been employed as raw material for the manufacture of the unique group of bronze figurines, the largest in Bronze Age Aegean. Ingots and bronze casting residues in the big sanctuary on Agios Georgios of Vounous could prove that. Moreover, not all sources of the Cretan oxide ingots have been identified yet. This again is a hypothesis. But could Epidavros Limira and Pavlopetri, also Aiostephanos at certain times, be the sites that regulated the exports of metals from the peninsula to Kythera and Western Crete in the early phase of the late Bronze Age? Systematic investigation is definitely required in order to confirm the mining of these deposits in prehistory and determine their isotopic composition. Also, it is interesting that Pavlopetri and Epidavros Limira are two of the very few sites that survived until the sub-Mycenaean period. Greece in the 11th century BC is not only at the event horizon of the transformation from palace to polis, but also from Bronze Age to Iron Age. Can it be a coincidence that southern Laconia boasts some of the richest iron ore deposits in the Aegean? To sum up, the available data point to communities open to experiment and to take risk, willing to selectively adapt external influences and at the same time to preserve traditions of the past, echoing the socio-political, economic, and cultural changes of the diverse stages of Mycenaean culture. Both as trading destinations and ports of call, Epidavros Limira and Pavlopetri have long histories going back to the Neolithic period. They flourished through close Scythian and Cretan interactions and partnerships and seem to have more mixed histories under the Mycenaean palatial administration. Their survival in post-palatial times and into the end of the sub-Mycenaean period suggests that sites with good harbors maintained their maritime connections and as a result were more resilient, continuing as refuge likely under the direction of strong, local sea-oriented groups. Both occupied strategic coastal positions on either side of the Malea Peninsula and offer safe haven to passing ships at times of increased mobility. As a pragmatic skill, seafaring would still be practiced after the big collapse, and local navigational knowledge would have been much appreciated, as would access to valuable local mineral resources. The region's geography and environment were combined with a sense of tradition and innovation deeply embedded in these communities to make and remake the culture and history of the Malea Peninsula during the late Bronze Age. The ports, harbors, and anchorages of the peninsula do act as important mines of information about the cultural and economic behavior of local Mycenaean coastal communities, especially in regions where life and progress were often determined by hostile environmental and geomorphological factors. Thank you very much for your attention.